بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters and friends. I pray you are all well. Alhamdulillah, I am well. And today we're going to be going through Reclaiming the Rainbow. And the purpose of this presentation is to summarize an in-depth essay that I have written that you can find available on the Sapiens Institute website. Excuse me. If you go to sapiensinstitute.org, you would find that in-depth essay that goes through five main theological, philosophical assumptions. Actually, there are no theological assumptions, but the philosophical assumptions, the epistemic assumptions, the metaphysical assumptions of the LGBTQ plus ideology. And it presents what these assumptions are, that they are not universal, they're not absolute, and they can be challenged. And at the same time, it provides a framework for Muslims to be able to engage with the LGBTQ plus ideology, and it responds to these assumptions through the understanding of the Islamic worldview or the Islamic paradigm. So I do want you guys to read that essay and explore the references and continue your kind of intellectual journey on this issue. But I have summarized this essay in today's presentation, and we're going to be unpacking the 5 main philosophical assumptions of the LGBTQ plus movement. And hopefully, if we have time, some of you can come live and we can have a discussion on this particular topic. Now, the first thing I want to say is it's become quite evident that society or some elements of society, some factions within our society have waged a full attack against the family, against gender, and against the moral and social hierarchies that are necessary for human flourishing. And the main weapon that these factions have used is actually the LGBTQ plus ideology. So the purpose of what I want to deliver to you today, the purpose of the presentation, is to unpack the 5 key assumptions underlying this ideology, explain where relevant that these assumptions are actually incoherent, showcase that the whole ideology itself is not universal and it is immoral. And I want to explain Islam's perspective on the LGBTQ plus ideology and expose their false assumptions and to show how coherent our worldview is. And I'm going to respond to certain key objections such as, love is love, and hopefully provide a method for engagement, intellectual engagement, which I know is sometimes quite rare with some advocates of the LGBTQ plus ideology. But nevertheless, it's important that we stay calm and rational and wise, and we use hikmah, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in chapter 16, that we call to Allah, to the sabil of Allah, to the way of Allah, to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with hikmah. And what is hikmah, my dear brothers and sisters? Yes, references to hikmah in the Quran are generally speaking the sunnah, the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what is hikmah in the context of the Quran and the Sunnah? And generally speaking, the ulama, the scholars have said that hikmah is having an Allah-pleasing goal that you want to achieve within a particular context, and you're taking ilm, knowledge that you may have, or you may have access to, or you may have connections with ulama and scholars, that you take that ilm and you apply it in that particular context to achieve the Allah-pleasing goal. And that's why we have to distinguish between ilm and context. Like the pious predecessors, one of them at least said that there are too many people of ilm and not enough people of hikmah. And Allah makes it clear in Surah Yusuf in chapter 12 of the Quran that there is a distinction between wise judgment and ilm and knowledge. Because Allah says, and we granted him wise judgment and ilm, and this is how we reward the doers of good. So it's connected to virtue, which is interesting because Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu an, it was attributed to him that he said that hikmah, you achieve hikmah through humility, that when you're humble, Allah will give you hikmah as if it's a gift, or Allah would facilitate hikmah and wise judgment for you. So we have to do this with hikmah. Now, hikmah doesn't mean being subjugated by the liberal paradigm, or hikmah doesn't mean deviating from Islamic principles. Hikmah doesn't mean being a coward. Yeah, that's very important, because sometimes when we hear this from some people, some elements in our community, have hikmah, akhi, have hikmah, my brother, have wisdom, my brother. Yeah, but wisdom, what does wisdom mean? It doesn't mean just shutting your mouth or basically not saying the right thing. Hikmah is having an Allah pleasing goal, right? That you want to achieve in a particular context, and you applying ilm in that context to achieve the goal. So there's a few things here. You have to know what the pleasing goal is to Allah. You have to know what the context is, which means you have to have an aql, an intellect, in order to understand the context. And you have to have the ilm, or you have to have access to the ilm through ulama and so on and so forth. And there must be an ability to make the ilm relevant in that context, applying the ilm. We could talk about this another time, but I thought I'd just bring that to your attention. So what are the 5 key assumptions that we want to be addressing? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that the LGBTQ plus ideology maintains that same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity are not immoral, and they are a right. So basically, same-sex intercourse is not immoral, and it is an individual right. Gender fluidity is not immoral, and it is an individual right. So what are the kind of 5 philosophical or epistemic assumptions that are behind this narrative, this assertion? Now, by the way, these assumptions, some of them can contradict each other, and there may be other assumptions, but I wanted to unpack the 5 key assumptions so you're equipped in order to basically provide a positive case from the perspective of Islam's view on this issue. So the first assumption is, my dear brothers and sisters, is that they say human beings possess their own bodies. They have ultimate ownership over their own bodies, and may, as such, do whatever they want with their bodies. Assumption number 2, same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity are lifestyle choices that are strictly individual matters. Every person has the fundamental individual right to adopt them should they wish to do so. Assumption number 3, there are no sound moral objections to same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity. So they say, look, there are no moral objections to this way of life, to gender fluidity and same-sex intercourse. So leave us alone. It's not immoral. Assumption number 4, sexuality and desires are identity-shaping features. This is important. Sexuality and desires are identity-shaping features. Therefore, they have to be respected. Final key assumption we're going to be unpacking: gender and sexuality are social constructs which have no fixed or innate essence. Okay, and this is important. Now, before we unpack these assumptions and actually respond to them from an Islamic perspective, there is an important note that we have to add. Whatever we say as Sapiens Institute, or whatever I say as an individual, we categorically condemn the liberal assumption that just because we disagree with someone's way of life, that means we want to inflict harm or be violent to them. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is actually a very dangerous neoliberal or postmodern narrative that some people like to insert into the discourse. And they basically say, oh, so you want me killed? Hold on a second. I disagree with your behavior and your worldview. Let's calm down a bit, right? Why are you jumping? How can you justify the logical link between me disagreeing with your worldview, me finding some of your behavior immoral and bad for society and bad for the individual? If me having that position, how does that now lead to your argument that I want you killed or I want harm? No, this is ridiculous. And that's why I like to remind them and us concerning chapter 60, verse 8 of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah says, Allah does not forbid you from dealing kindly and fairly with those who have neither fought nor driven you out of your homes. Surely Allah loves those who are fair. Now, Allah uses a key word here, and the word is derived from bir. Now, bir comes from the triliteral stem ba, ra, ra. Now, this root has many meanings. It means, for example, to be free of impurity, to be free of guilt, to be pious, to be devoted, to fulfill one's promise and goodness. Like Allah's name is Al-Bar. He is the source of all goodness. He is the greatest benefactor. Now, in the context of the above verse that we just mentioned, it means to do good, to be charitable, to show kindness. And this is very interesting because the same root has been used in Quran 1932 in the context of one's mother, right? How to treat your mother. And I think it's the words of Isa alayhi salam, Jesus upon whom be peace, when he said, and made me cherish my mother. And this root is also used in Surah Al-Baqarah, the 2nd chapter, verse 44, in the context of righteousness. Allah says, do you bid people towards piety and forget to do it yourself? So the reason I'm mentioning this is because, look, if someone's not fighting you for your religion, right? Yeah, not expelling you from your home, Allah is telling us to be fair with them, to be just with them, to be good with them, to be pious towards them, to be righteous towards them. So this is a general principle that's very, very important. So you could disagree with someone, whether they're an atheist, a Christian, a Jew, a Magian, whatever, right? The point here is, if they're not fighting you for your religion and they're not expelling you from your home, then you should be just, you should be righteous, you should be good to them. This is very important to highlight, because we categorically reject the total nonsense that coming out from some liberals and postmodern types when they say, you disagree with me and my worldview and my life and my lifestyle, therefore you want me killed, you want to hurt me, you want to harm me. I just relax, yeah. Relax with this snowflake attitude. It's not working. We're intellectual human beings. We're living in a diverse society. There's a kind of, interplay, if you like, of different worldviews and ideas, and we're allowed to discuss them, and I'm allowed to disagree with you, and you're allowed to disagree with me, and let the best argument win, and let the truth prevail. And it's as simple as that. Now, it's very important to understand, my dear brothers, when we're going to be unpacking these 5 key assumptions, to understand that every truth claim has assumptions. There is no such thing as a claim that is free from any philosophical or rational or intellectual assumption. You could take any idea, and you can unpack an assumption, right? And this is very important to understand, because sometimes, we think when something has an assumption, it means it's not true, or when something has an assumption, or only a few things have an assumption or have assumptions. That's actually not the case. Things can have assumptions and be true, and things can have assumptions and be not true, and we just have to unpack what these assumptions are. And that's why it's very important to understand this, because I don't want us to be accused of finding weak assumptions of a particular worldview and building a straw man, meaning building, a false representation of their worldview and their beliefs and their assumptions. We're not doing that. We're not making up assumptions deliberately. Every worldview has its own assumptions, right? Every truth claim has its own assumptions. Let me give an example. Secularism, right? So the kind of secular vision, worldview, perspective, assertion basically says church and state must be separate. Religion and state must be separate. So does that have assumptions? Of course it does. Let's think about them. The first assumption, at least, is that secularism, the idea that religion or church and state must be separate, has its own epistemological and metaphysical biases, right? So the way that its understanding of truth, its understanding of the sources of knowledge, its truth claims, and its key assumptions about the source and nature of reality, they have their own presuppositions. For example, it views God and religion as unable to govern societies consisting of groups and individuals with competing religious worldviews. That's an assumption. The reason they're saying church and state must be separate is because they're saying that God and religion is unable to govern societies with, groups and individuals that have competing worldviews. Now, they may claim their assumption is grounded in reason and justified, but the point is, it's an assumption, right? The other kind of assumption is it conceives religion as impotent in addressing the political problems of non-adherence, right? So, they would argue that if the Catholic Church was in power now, especially the medieval conception of the Catholic Church, it cannot deal with Muslims, it cannot deal with Jews, it cannot deal with atheists, it can only deal with their own people. So, on a state level, for different people to live together, the Catholic tradition, as per the medieval conception, is impotent with regards to addressing political problems with diverse people. Now, whether they believe that is true or false is a different discussion. The point is, it's an assumption behind that statement. Another assumption is this, that secularism is kind of, how can I call it, metaphysically narcissistic. Yeah, what I mean by this. So secularism assumes distinct, mutually exclusive categories of the political and the religious, right? There isn't a religion that can deal with politics effectively, and politics should basically not say much about religion. Yes, there are nuances and overlaps and gray areas, I get it, but generally speaking, that's the kind of position. So what secularism does, it kind of projects itself onto religion, stripping away its kind of political character. And it essentially claims that only secularism can deal with the political and religion is reduced to private affairs. That's an assumption. It's a metaphysical assumption in a way, or at least a philosophical one, yeah. And it's kind of philosophically narcissistic that way, right? Like they project themselves onto religion and all other worldviews, right? Only secularism has the ability to deal with the public affairs, with politics. Religion is reduced to private affairs. So it's projecting itself that way because it strips the political character of religion, or at least of some religions, especially Islam, because Islam also has an obvious political character. And it strips it away, saying, no, it's just reduced to private affairs. Or at least it says that if it does go into the politics, it cannot achieve what secularism can achieve, and it can't deal with diverse groups of people with different competing worldviews. Now, whether you agree with this analysis or not is neither here or there. It was a quick example to show you that every statement, every truth claim has its own assumptions. And this is very, very important. So let's go to the first assumption of the LGBTQ plus ideology. And we spoke about this, and let me just summarize. Human beings possess their own bodies, right? So this is kind of secular materialistic in nature, okay? So this assumption amongst many of its adherents, and yes, there are people who believe in God that follow this worldview as well, which we're going to discuss very briefly. But generally speaking, it's a kind of secular materialistic assertion, right? That human beings, have sovereignty over their own bodies. There are masters of their own bodies. They own themselves. They possess their own bodies. Now, don't get me wrong, Islam has given us agency over our bodies, but we have to use our bodies in a way that is pleasing to Allah. But metaphysically, fundamentally, we reject this claim, which we're going to discuss. But what they basically say is humans own their own bodies. If they own their own bodies, they can do whatever they want with their bodies, right? Obviously, there are some caveats like the harm principle, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But the point is, they say you could do whatever you want with your body. And this includes legal intercourse with the opposite gender, identifying as any gender, intercourse with the same gender, transitioning into the opposite sex. And that's what it includes. Now, the only restriction, as we mentioned, is that in doing whatever they want with their bodies, they cannot cause significant harm to others or themselves, which is based on the harm principle. And the harm principle, as was cited, well, as we can cite the British philosopher John Stuart Mill, is basically the idea that people should be free to act as they wish as long as their actions do not cause harm to others. And John Stuart Mill, elaborated on this. He basically said, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, okay? Now, obviously, this is a contentious issue because, what is defined as harm? This is harm to others. But what does harm to others mean? What is the relation between the individual and society, society and the individual? If you have an liberal assumption, an atomistic and individualistic assumption of the human being, that the primacy is on the individual and the individual is like an abstract entity devoid from social obligations and attachments, then you're going to have a different understanding what harm means, right? And this is something that we can unpack a little bit later. So they, you know, this is why many actually, secularists and liberals and postmodernists and basically I call them Ahl al-Hawa, the people of desire. Like pro-abortion activists, they often employ this and they say, my body, my choice, right? It's actually a ridiculous slogan, because the assumption behind that slogan is that they actually have, they're sovereign over their own bodies, they own their bodies, and they could do whatever they want within the law. Well, we reject that as Muslims, which we're going to discuss in a few moments, inshallah. Allah fundamentally owns you. Allah is the sovereign. Allah is the king of all kings. Allah owns our bodies. He's given us rights and he's given us agency that we can use our bodies within the law. But what law? Not liberal or secular law, Islamic law, and within the Islamic moral framework. And we can't fundamentally argue that it's mine, I could do whatever I want with it, because it's actually not yours, it's been given by Allah. So you can only do what you want within what Allah wants, right? And what Allah has commanded, and what He's allowed and not allowed, right? And that's a different discussion for sure. Now, I did say this has a secular materialistic character, this whole kind of assertion that it's my body, I possess my body, I can do whatever I want, because they basically said that, they reject, or they don't really take seriously the idea that God created them and God owns their bodies, right? So some religious people who adopt the LGBTQ plus ideology may believe in God. They may even believe that God owns their bodies, but they would basically say, and they would argue that He allows us to do whatever we want with our bodies. So what they really have assumed within that is a kind of either deistic understanding or a kind of secular or liberal epistemological argument or assumption. They're saying, yeah, God created us, he owns our bodies fundamentally, but He's allowed us to do whatever we want. And therefore, basically, they just basically have become subjugated within the secular or liberal paradigm. And it's a liberal epistemological argument. Why? Because they would refer to liberal laws, they will refer to liberal morality, they will refer to secular laws and secular morality, in order for them to say we can do whatever we want, irrespective if God created us and owns our bodies or not. So that's a very important caveat. So that's the first assumption, yeah? So why is it an assumption? Well, we know it's quite obvious, because they basically say that, I could transition to any gender. I can basically have sex with the opposite sex, or have same-sex relations, no problem. I could have same-sex intercourse, no problem. It doesn't harm others. I fundamentally own my body. I can do whatever I want as long as it doesn't harm others, or in particular doesn't harm myself to a certain degree. And they cite the harm principle, which we've mentioned, but the harm principle is contentious because it has its own assumptions as well. Because what is deemed as harm to society, right? And that has its own kind of perspective as well. If you're liberal, you're going to have a liberal conception of the relation between the individual and society, and so on and so forth. And harm will be restricted maybe just to society, because the understanding of crime and morality is between individuals, or individual and society. God has no say. You can't do a crime against God. But we actually do believe that in the Islamic tradition as well. And we also believe that there is an interesting interplay between individuals and society and individuals. We don't have a liberal conception. The liberals have an individualistic conception. Therefore, what they would deem as harm would be different to us, because we don't have this kind of individualistic, atomistic understanding of the human being. Because we do believe that people's actions on a social level can evoke and produce harm. It can be detrimental to social cohesion and so on and so forth. So let's go to assumption number two. Assumption number two, as we say, is their individual right? Human beings can transition into any gender. Human beings can have same-sex intercourse, because it's the individual right. And that's what it is. It's just an individual right. Now, this individual right basically is based on the idea that the individual has a right to love anyone in any way they want and express that love in any way that they want, irrespective of their gender. Obviously, there are legal parameters such as age and so on and so forth, but generally speaking, you could love who you want in any way that you want, as long as it's within the law, secular law, and you could change and transition to any gender, right? And they also assert that, you know, identifying as any gender, irrespective of biological and cultural markers, and transitioning into any gender is a moral and legal entitlement, right? That's what the LGBTQ kind of ideology would say. It's a moral and legal entitlement. Now, there's a few things here. This assumption gives the importance just to the individual, right? So the primacy is on the individual. So there is a kind of individualistic notion of rights and an individualistic conception of rights. Now, we don't have to talk about the difference between positive human rights and negative human rights. Generally speaking, in the West, there's a kind of negative conception of human rights, but we don't have to go into this into too much depth. The point is, there is a particular conception of individual rights, yeah? And this LGBTQ plus assumption assumes a secular or liberal conception of rights. And in this context is that individuals are rational agents. They can decide what they can do with the bodies and who they decide to have intercourse with. And social obligations or attachments, or even divine obligations, or the obligations we have to the divine, are not considered as important or relevant, or they're not considered at all. Yeah. So as you can see here, they have a particular conception of rights. And this is very important for Muslims, by the way, because when we kind of discuss our worldview, our paradigm with, you know, our fellow human beings, sometimes we jump into the paradigm of our interlocutor. We jump into the paradigm of the one who is disagreeing with us. And especially when it comes to notion of rights. Yeah, Islam believes in human rights too. So we're going to adopt the, you know, the UN Charter of the, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yeah, we believe in every single one, and we believe in your conception of them and your application and the way you prioritize them. No, this is complete nonsense. Number one, it's not a universal declaration. It's actual fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually a liberal project. This is well known. If you read the works by Professor, his name just has actually jumped out of my brain. Professor, I forgot his name. He wrote a book. It's called, actually, let's go to Sheikh Google, yeah. The Liberal Project, the Liberal Project and Human Rights. I think the book is called Liberal Project and Human Rights. That's the one. His name is, yeah, so it's called The Liberal Project on Human Rights, the Theory and Practice of a New World Order. Professor John Sharvey from LSE University and Eliza, I can't pronounce the rest of her name, Kaczynska Ney. Yeah. And in the introduction, he talks about this. No, sorry, not in the introduction. Throughout the whole book, he basically argues it's a liberal concept. It's a liberal project, right? Now, there may be some overlaps. We'll agree with them, you know, in kind of the kind of, there are kind of commonalities for sure, but their conception, application, and prioritization is done through the Islamic paradigm, right? I mean, that's why it's very important to highlight this, because sometimes we get affected by the kind of hegemonic discourse of, you know, liberalism and secularism, and that's the nature of ideologies, especially liberalism and secularism. It wants to basically subjugate us from a worldview perspective. And that's why, generally speaking, Muslim religious minorities, religious speakers, religious intellectuals would only be practically tolerated if there are liberalized versions of themselves. But generally speaking, Islam doesn't have that kind of ability to be subjugated, you know. And Muslims are not going to be a subjugated, dominated minority from an intellectual perspective. We're going to actually articulate ourselves positively. Yeah, there are some Muslims who actually have been consumed by that hegemonic narrative, right? But they're easily exposed within our community. And unfortunately, our Christian cousins, if you want to call them that, especially the academic types, you know, they have stripped away any kind of real character of Christianity from a moral, legal perspective, and it's just become just liberalized. And that's why many Christian academics will attack Muslims and people like myself, or Muslim academics, whatever the case may be, and they would have liberal arguments against Islam. It won't be Christian arguments. And that's why one way of dealing with them is to ask them, well, are you arguing from a Christian perspective or a liberal perspective? I mean, who are you? You know, you claim to be this Christian, but you sound like a liberal and a secularist, right? I had that recently on Twitter. You had some so-called academics who just made certain statements, and I unpacked their assumptions and the falsities attached to their perspective, and I don't think they responded. But the point is, yes, you got the point. Anyway, let's move away from Sheikh Google. So the primacy is on the individual, right? And this is important. So we would argue as Muslims, well, we have our own conception of rights. Yeah, who has the right to give us our rights, right? And this is quite interesting because even the idea of freedom, which is basically the absence of coercion, and the absence of coercion is fundamentally, if you study it properly, is that your rights have not been violated. But then the argument is, well, what conception of rights are you talking about? So if you have a particular conception of rights, and as long as those rights are not violated, then you're free. And we would say the same thing. Allah has given us rights. He created us. He is the King of all kings. He is the creator. He is the most merciful. He is the source of all goodness. He is the wise. He is the loving. And he has given us rights for all human beings. We even have this concept in Islam, hukuk al-ibad, the rights of the servants, the rights of the worldly servants. And we would say as long as those rights are not violated, then we're free. They would say, for example, well, Islam is coercive and prevents freedom because they are assuming a liberal notion of rights, or a negative notion of rights, or individualistic notion of rights. And they would say, well, Islam doesn't allow some of those, therefore you are against freedom or you are oppressors. No, we're going to reject that claim because we don't adopt your conception of rights. So, and as long as we have an understanding of the conception of rights as per what Allah and His Messenger have given us, as long as those conception of rights are not violated, then you're free. So the debate shifts from pointing the finger of calling you an oppressor or that person an oppressor. It shifts to, well, what is the correct conception of rights? And that's what we want them. That's what Dawah is about. We want to talk to them about the unicity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the tawheed of Allah, why He's worthy of worship, that He exists. He deserves our humble adoration, that we have to submit to Allah, to love Allah, to adore Allah, and to obey Allah. And likewise, we have to obey the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's the second assumption. Third assumption, they would argue that there are no sound moral objections to same-sex intercourse and to, what you might call it, gender fluidity. That's what they're going to say. There is no sound moral objections, right? Leave us alone. We're not harming anybody. Why do you think it's immoral? It's not immoral. Yeah, stop being a bigot, right? They'll have all of these kind of narratives. So what they're basically saying is that same-sex intercourse, gender fluidity do not have any wrong-making features. Now, that claim itself is basically assumes a particular moral framework, and this is important. Yeah, it assumes a particular moral framework, because what do they say? They say there is nothing about same-sex intercourse and nothing about gender fluidity that inflicts significant harm, or violates anyone's autonomy, is unfair, or violates anyone's individual rights. So there's nothing about same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity that harms someone, violates someone's rights or autonomy, is unfair, or violates anyone's individual rights. So therefore, they would say it's not immoral. There's nothing wrong with same-sex intercourse. There's nothing wrong with gender fluidity. Now, but there is an assumption behind this. There's a clever game that's being played. The assumption is that we adopt a moral position, or they adopt a moral position of utilitarianism and deontological ethics. Yeah. So they adopt a form of ethics known as utilitarianism or deontological ethics. So these are normative ethical theories, and they adopt these theories as a kind of moral reference or frame in order to understand what is good and what is bad, how to act and how to not act. Yeah. So what is the logical conclusion of their argument? They basically say, if there is nothing morally wrong with homosexuality, then there is no reasonable basis on which to deny homosexual individuals and same-sex couples the same rights and privileges enjoyed by heterosexual individuals and opposite-sex couples. Now, from their perspective, they're trying to make it coherent, although historically, the deontological ethicists and the utilitarian ethicists, they actually used arguments within their framework to argue against homosexuality, right? So it's not simple as, yeah, we're adopting these secular normative ethical theories. I'm going to adopt utilitarianism and I'm going to adopt deontological ethics and I'm going to maybe combine the both. And as a result, I'm going to show that same-sex intercourse is not a problem and gender fluidity is not a problem. No. It is not as simple as that, because when you study even these normative ethical theories, especially historically, you see these ethicists who actually used arguments within that moral paradigm to argue against same-sex intercourse. But anyway, we are where we are. The point here is this shows how ideology, affects the way we understand even our own moral ethical paradigm. But the point is very important here. And what is the important point? The important point is that this is only morally coherent from their reference point, from their moral theory. And their moral theory, or the normative ethical theory, is utilitarianism and deontological ethics, which we're going to quickly make you understand what these are if you don't know. But the point here is, it's only coherent from that perspective. We are under no moral obligation, no epistemic obligation to adopt deontological ethics or utilitarianism. Yeah, we are under no obligation. We're divine command theorists, Allah's commands, right? And we could show how they are superior. So in order for you to understand this a little bit more, what is utilitarianism without going into too much detail? Utilitarianism focuses on utility, basically the well-being, right? So it focuses on the collective welfare, and it identifies moral goodness with the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, which is called the greatest happiness principle. This is different from ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is also a form of a consequentialist theory, just like utilitarianism, because it focuses on the consequences. But ethical egoism is basically that, what is moral is that you just focus on your own individual happiness, not the collective. And that's the main difference between ethical egoism and utilitarianism. Anyway, but focusing on utilitarianism, and they focus on the greatest happiness principle, which is what is good is that if there is the increase in collective happiness, or there is a decrease in collective suffering or ill-being. Yeah. So it identifies immorality, therefore, as more pain or ill-being collectively than well-being and happiness for the greatest number of people. So what they would say is maximizing happiness or minimizing sadness or minimizing suffering for the greatest number of people is basically the best thing to do, is what is good, right? So if a moral action increases the ill-being, the suffering of the collective, then that is morally bad. If an action increases the well-being or the happiness for the collective, then it is morally good. And this type of consequentialist theory, utilitarianism, derives from the 19th century British philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, if you're a critical thinker, you'll be thinking now straight away, hold on a second, well, what is happiness? What is well-being? Yeah, that's another interesting insight. Also, if we have eschatological notions, if we believe in the akhirah, then it skews the kind of utilitarian calculus now. Because if there is a heaven and a hell, then the greatest well-being is that what you do here is going to make you happy forever, right? So if what you do here is going to make you sad forever, i.e. go to hell, then by virtue of that, that's an immoral thing. So you could even, turn the tables on them, right? You could even adopt utilitarianism. You could say, yeah, I for argument's sake, let's take utilitarianism as a strong moral theory to find out what is good and bad. However, I believe in the hereafter, and I can prove that's the case. And I believe some actions lead you to hell, some actions lead you to paradise, and these are eternal realities. So, I believe same-sex intercourse is one of those actions, and therefore it's going to be ill-being and suffering for an eternity. Therefore, according to the principles of utilitarianism, same-sex intercourse is morally wrong. Now, obviously, they'll disagree because these are secular normative ethical theories, yeah? But again, why why are you imposing secularism on me? I believe in the akhirah. I believe in the day of judgment. I believe in heaven and hell, and I could prove these things to be true. So why are you imposing this on me? And that's an interesting take. You could turn the tables on this one. Right, deontological ethics. The term deontology finds its etymology in the Greek word deon, which means duty or obligation, or that which is necessary, hence moral necessity. Yeah. And generally speaking, the deontological approach rejects that the moral worth of an action is based on its consequences. And that's the consequentialist theories like ethical egoism and utilitarianism that we just briefly discussed. So it doesn't really say the consequences of a particular action dictate the moral worth of an action. For them, it's more about, moral duties or obligations, and they develop moral criteria to discuss what those moral duties and obligations are. And therefore they would argue that moral agents like human beings have to honor human rights and meet moral obligations even at the cost of an optimal outcome, even if it basically decreases the collective happiness. Yeah. So they're not consequentialists. However, if you want to get really, really nuanced, it's not always the case that deontological ethicists deny all type of consequences, and it's not the case that utilitarian ethicists deny any type of obligation. It's not. There are some subtleties and nuances here, but generally speaking, deontological ethics doesn't really focus on the consequences for the moral worth of a particular action. They say it's about developing rational criteria to assess what these moral duties and obligations are, and therefore moral agents have to honor these duties and obligations even at the cost of an optimal outcome, which would be at odds with the utilitarian ethicist. And there are three main categories of deontological ethics: agent-centered deontological ethics, patient-centered deontological theories, and contractualist deontological theories. We don't have to go into them. It's not necessary, but I think you get the point. But just to re-emphasize, deontological ethics argues that the moral worth of an action does not depend on the consequences, but a different criteria should be used, such as using rational criteria to actually understand what is a moral duty and a moral obligation. Here's an example. In the early 19th century America, many members of the anti-slavery movement argued that slavery was wrong, even though slaveholders and the Southern American society in general, they economically benefited from slavery. So according to the utilitarian thinkers, they'll be like, you know what? Slavery is not that bad, because collectively, on the whole, our utilitarian calculus shows that there's generally more happiness and well-being for the whole. Forget these guys, right? These black people, these Africans. That's what they're going to say. Forget them. They're a minority, because when you look at the whole Southern American society and the slaveholders, increase economics, prosperity, you could build roads, hospitals, you could have happiness and well-being, fine, at the cost of this minority. But look, utilitarian calculus says it's the net calculus, isn't it? It's the net calculation. What is the net happiness? And you have greater happiness and you have greatest well-being. So for the utilitarian, they're like, you know what? Maybe slavery is not bad after all. That's maybe how they were arguing at that time. But that's why, generally speaking, we can't develop straw men. We can't develop misrepresentations, because even though that the West, on balance, has a utilitarian philosophy, they also combine deontological ethics as well. But another discussion for another time. Now, historically, the most influential theorist with regards to deontological ethics was the German philosopher. His name was Immanuel Kant. He died in around 1804, born in 1724. Assumption number 4, identity shaping features. So what the LGBTQ plus community assume here is that desires shape people's identity, right? And their sense of self as human beings. And without freely exploring, the desires of, sexuality and gender, a person will be deprived of a crucial element of authenticity in their life, right? Interestingly, Ellen Riggle and Sharon Rostosky, do apologize, They basically summarized this kind of argument in the work A Positive View of the LGBTQ. And they say, claiming our LGBT identities is an act of self-empowerment and may enhance our sense of well-being. Living our life authentically, even though it may feel risky at times, facilitates personal growth. Coming to love and appreciate ourselves for who we are frees up our energy to pursue goals and activities that are meaningful to us. So they would say that restricting individuals from freely exploring their sexuality and gender identity based on these desires would result in psychological harm and hinder personal development. Thus, the advocates of the LGBTQ plus ideology are basically saying that people have autonomy. They could determine their own authentic identity based on the desires and based on their feelings. Now, and obviously, I find this very crude and very kind of bestial, and it's very problematic because if you continue with that type of logic, it can actually create harm, right? But we could discuss that in a few moments. But we're just here to show what this assumption is. The assumption number 5 is basically gender identity, LGBTQ plus narrative. They basically say that sexuality and gender are social constructs. They have no fixed essence. Yeah. And this basically kind of opens the door to this idea of queer theory, right? And many of the queer theorists are basically those who advocate for gender fluidity, and they basically contend that both sexuality and gender are just mere social constructs, right? And they're not determined by any biological markers, right? And queer theory, generally speaking, and there's lots to talk about, of course, from an academic perspective, but we can't, we have limited time. But queer theory, generally speaking, is motivated by an uncontroversial and justified point, which is that our understanding of masculine and feminine has changed over the years, meaning in Western society. Not only that, they also argue that biological essentialism is not accepted in academic discourse, which is true. Because a biological essentialism basically says that it's only biology that dictates who we are. But obviously, we know it's a combination of biology and society. But what they say now, they go to the extreme, and they say it's not biology at all, right? And what's interesting, queer theory, the kind of which is really justifying gender fluidity, is based on some postmodern principles. Now, whether these postmodern principles can be used within a certain framework, whether or not they are not adhered to anymore, this is not the discussion here. The point is they were at some point, or are, according to some postmodern principles. And the first principle is basically radical skepticism. Yeah. So what does this mean? So generally speaking, in postmodern discourse, radical skepticism basically says there is no objective method to obtain objective truths about reality. Simple as that. And therefore, from that perspective, there is a commitment to cultural constructivism. Now, we don't have to discuss this, but what they say here is, from the point of view of gender fluidity, therefore, if you apply it, biology, therefore gender, is a social construction perpetuated in language. Therefore, biological truths and truths about gender are a form of socialization. Okay, this is very important to understand. So they apply the kind of postmodern principle of radical skepticism, that there is no objective method to obtain objective truths about reality, and therefore biology and gender is a social construction perpetuated in language, right? And therefore these truths about biology and gender are a form of socialization, because people in societies have hierarchies. These hierarchies have power. And that leads to the next principle, which is on social hierarchies. So a key postmodern principle is that social hierarchies are basically a society, or they exist within societies, and they're based on systems of power. And so therefore they say there are social hierarchies, and these social hierarchies hold the power. They decide what is knowledge. They decide what is known, what cannot be known, what knowledge can be obtained. And what queer theory basically assumes is that, the fixed categories like sexuality are a form of oppression, right? Because you have these social hierarchies, and you have people in these social hierarchies are holding the power, and their power basically is a form of oppression because they are the ones who decide what can be known and what can't be known. And some queerists, like queer theorists, like Judith Butler, for example, they would argue that people are oppressed by social narratives, right? And these social narratives are built by the use of language. And that's why queer theorists, they like to agitate the language, change the language, and like to disrupt the social hierarchies. Some even go to the point that they say social hierarchies and these so-called truths perpetuated by language, which is perpetuated and developed, if you like, by these powerful hierarchies, are a form of violence. That's what they would say. That's why you may see some videos and you're being violent to me just because, if you're having a rational discussion saying, no, look, these are biological facts and there are some social facts and this is how we use language, and language is a representation of reality, they would actually deny that and they would think that's a form of violence, right? So this is very important to understand. We'll unpack it further, but it's very important to understand that there are two main key postmodern principles that are being used in queer theory. One is radical skepticism and one is social hierarchies. Radical skepticism basically is that there is no objective truth to come to, there is no objective method to obtain objective truths about reality. And therefore biology and gender is just, we should be skeptical about them. There is no truth. And they basically say the other principle is that society is based on systems of social hierarchies and power. And the people on top of those hierarchies that hold the power, they decide what can be known and what can't be known. And they use a particular language and they try and perpetuate those so-called truths and that so-called knowledge through that particular use of language. And queer theory says, well, we could change the social hierarchy, we could change the language, therefore we could change the truth, right? And that's why if you go into more academic studies of queer theory, they would even argue that you will never reach the truth because you always have to change language. There was always going to be a power struggle, right? So there are some key thinkers for you to just note, postmodern and queer theorists. For example, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who was a nasty human being. I think he raped young boys in graveyards. I keep on forgetting the countries, either Tunisia or Algeria. You could check this out for yourself. And he wrote, for example, The Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. He wrote Madness and Civilizations. He wrote The History of Sexuality, which is a multi-volume history of Western sexuality. And his key ideas were basically centered of power, and what we know to be true are just constructions of language, which he called discourses. And he saw power like a grid rather than like a boulder on top of you. It's more like a grid. And his work is quite canonical for queer theorists, right? You also have Jacques Derrida, another French philosopher. Why do all these dumb ideas come to French philosophers? I don't know, man. Maybe something's in the garlic. Or the French wine, Allah knows. So Jacques Derrida, hero of grammatology, writing and difference, and speech and phenomena. And his key ideas were basically language is binary and hierarchical. And he's the one who introduced the idea of deconstruction, which can have its uses, I guess, within a particular framework. But the point is, he argued that language is unreliable because it's relational. So what he was saying is that language does not represent reality. It's relational within itself. So meaning only exists in relation to the discourse in which is embedded, right? So words don't really represent reality. That's what he's basically saying. And, discourses can create and maintain oppression because someone controls that particular use of language, right? And he says it was relational, and that relational binary aspect of language is, because it creates hierarchy, it can be oppressive. So, for example, he developed this idea of phallogocentrism, which is it's a social reality that is constructed through language that privileges the masculine. So when you say what is the opposite of male, someone would say female, because no one really says, well, one could argue no one says what's the opposite of a female. It's a male. No, and the male comes first. So there's a relational dynamic here. Male first, female second, right? Husband and wife. That's how we use language. You don't say the wife and the husband, right? And given the fact that someone who holds power has developed language in that particular way, and language is relational and hierarchical, and meaning only exists in relation to these to the discourse. It doesn't represent a reality. And therefore, you should change the language because it's oppressive, right? And this is obviously very dangerous. And he also had this other idea that he coined, which was called logocentrism, which emphasizes the privileged role that the logos or speech has been accorded to the Western tradition. Yeah. But if you want to summarize his ideas, language is binary, hierarchical. People of power use language. Language doesn't necessarily represent reality. Meaning only exists embedded within that relational discourse. And language itself favors the masculine. And therefore, it's oppressive, because who's dictating how we use the order of words and the way they relate to each other? Some oppressive man has done that, right? And also, language can be made up to free us because it doesn't represent reality, right? So that's Derrida. And so you could start to understand what we've said about the queer theory and those two applied principles, where these ideas have been coming from. You also have Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, she was a feminist existential philosopher. Her life was a contradiction, to be honest, because you should see the way she spoke about Jean-Paul Sartre, her partner. But anyway, that's another discussion for another time. And in the second sex, she basically says that someone is not born a woman, they become a woman. So she's basically saying that, what it means to be a woman is not necessarily a biological fact. And so she facilitated the idea. It was like the early kind of thinker that basically said that the sex you are assigned is not the sex that you can become. Yeah. Also, you have Gail Rubin. She's an anthropologist. She wrote, for example, The Traffic in Women, Note on the Political Economy of Sex. She also wrote Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. You can see that a lot of these thinkers are fetishizing sex, right? Especially Foucault, that history of sexuality and the multi-volume work. These people had a fetish with regards to gender, sex. I kind of believe that it's not purely motivated by rational or intellectual concerns. I think they had issues at home. I mean, there's a psychodynamic element there for sure. But anyway, key ideas are that the objective of family is to reproduce gender and to make heterosexuality normal, right? That's why they would have words like, I think it's heteronormativity, yeah? And she basically in her work allowed the idea that gender can be produced. I mean, one of her essays, if you read like the first 3-4 paragraphs, she's kind of justifying, I think, child rape, from what I remember. It's been a while since I read it, but just look at it. Yeah. Anyway, she allowed that the idea that gender can be produced, and that there are systems in place to reproduce gender and heteronormativity. Yeah. So gender norms like male and female are repressive because family is an oppressive structure, and it's been designed to produce to make heterosexuality normal, and we conform to them. Therefore, we have to break down the family, break down the hierarchy. Judith Butler, I think she's still alive. Now, interestingly, she's done some great work for the Palestinians from a dehumanization perspective, right? And that's why we have to be very kind of careful when we enjoy some person's work, that it basically creates this immoral bias for other work. We just have to be just. Yes, thank you very much. You've talking about dehumanization. We agree on these principles, but there's some other stuff that you've been talking about that is utter nonsense and it's destroying society. So her key work was Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Now, this is very important because this will make a lot of sense to you, right? She basically came up with the idea called gender performativity. Now, she's not saying that you perform gender like an actress or an actor, but rather gender is a thing that a person does. Yeah. And there are no innate factors. Remember, they don't believe in any biological markers, right? No biological markers. This is very important. Remember, they're skeptical about this as well, and they reject it categorically. They don't say it's a combination of social, pressure or social realities and biology. They say no, biology is out. We're very skeptical about biology because of these truths, so-called biological truths, are from hierarchies with people who hold the power, and they tell us what we should know, what we shouldn't know. and they use a certain language to actually frame, to perpetuate those truths. And because they have a Derridian understanding of language doesn't represent reality and it's relational, we could challenge the relational aspect. We could challenge that language, create a new language. We could challenge the hierarchy, therefore there'd be a different truth. Therefore we should be very skeptical about any truth, even biological truth. And this is troubling, right? Anyway, so what she basically says, and it's actually quite smart, it's smart, but it's dumb at the same time. So gender performativity is that you don't perform gender like an actor, but you basically have your own agency and power, and you have your own use of language, and by virtue of that you could create your own gender. And she gives an example of a priest in many Western countries. You have a priest in the wedding ceremony, and the priest says, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. See, Derrida will be rolling in his grave here. Why do you say man and wife? You say wife and man. Change the phallogocentrism here. Yeah. Anyway, so they say, I now pronounce you man and wife. She makes an interesting argument. She says, well, before the priest said that statement, they haven't really changed, right? But once he's made that statement, now they're man and wife. See, you could change your reality through power and language. In this case, the priest had the power to make that announcement legally and religiously, according to the Western Christian tradition. And he used language to perpetuate that, to make that happen, which was, I now pronounce you man and wife. Ergo, therefore, I can use my own agency and my own language, and I could be a two-spirit penguin, just by virtue of my own agency, power, and the language that I've used, right? It's actually ridiculous, right? It's smart in a way, but and that's why these people need to study more philosophy, because there is a kind of comparing apples and pears here. You can't compare the priest and what he has said and the kind of legal announcement of a union between a man and a wife in marriage with gender. You just can't do that, because the priest would have no authority if there was a man and a woman wanted to get married, and he basically said, and now in front of us today there is a cat and a dog, and we're going to do a animalistic sexual union between the cat and the dog, and we're going to pronounce them as cat wife and dog husband. It wouldn't work, because there is no reality in any kind of alternate universe, or even in this universe, whereby his power and the language that he's used now makes sense, because in front of him is actually a male and a female. In front of him is someone who basically wants to be considered as a man and a woman, and they want to be in a union called marriage, which has a particular moral, historical, cultural basis. So although power and language plays a role, but there are limits to that. But what she's done, she's broken those limits. And by virtue of what she's saying, me now right in front of you, I can say with this beard, with this hair, with this tired voice, it sounds tired, I guess, I can say I am a black lesbian. And remember, queer theory, they should never have a problem with this, because they reject any biological markers. Biology, right? You have to be radically skeptical. And there are social hierarchies, and people are hold power in these hierarchies, and they use language in particular way to perpetuate those truths, right? So what you see of me with a beard and I look like a man, those things we need to challenge them and be radically skeptical about them, because they're perpetuated by people who hold power in those hierarchies, and they're perpetuated by language that doesn't represent reality. Remember the Derridian understanding of language? Language doesn't represent reality; it's relational, right? The meaning is within the discourse. So Hamza can say, why not? With his own power and his own language, because he's agitating that discourse, agitating that social hierarchy, agitating that biological truth, those so-called biological truths, agitating that use of language. And he's saying he has power. He's making his own language up. Henceforth, his name is now Sambina, and he is a black lesbian. Yeah, I can say that within these principles. Absurd, absolutely absurd. So, what's the key point here now? The key point here now, my dear brothers and sisters, which is very important, is to understand that given the fact that we can unpack these assumptions, and intuitively and rationally, we know these assumptions, and I've indicated it throughout me every time we've spoken about one of these assumptions, at least 3 or 4 of them, that they are not universal nor absolute. And this is the point here. The very fact that we could unpack these assumptions to these so-called activists and ideologues, we could say to them, you have your worldview with these assumptions. These assumptions are not absolute and they're not universal. So why are you forcing this down our throats? Why are you acting in this hegemonic way? The irony, you're the one who's using the hierarchy and the power to shove this down our throats. These assumptions are assumptions and they're not universal and they are not absolute by virtue of what we've just discussed. Therefore, you have no right to shove it down our throats. And Muslims and humanity in general are under no epistemic and under no moral obligation to accept what you're saying. This is why it's very rare to have a philosophical, decent, rational discussion with these people, because they'll just get angry. You're being violent to me. How dare you? You know, you're immoral, right? They're the real bigots, to be honest. Because we want to have this discussion, yes, nicely, peacefully, with wisdom and with in an amicable way, you know, rational, polite discourse. Allow us to have it. And we want to expose the fact that you have assumptions, the very fact you have these assumptions, the very fact that they're not absolute and they're not universal should calm you down. And you should not be hegemonic and force it down our throats and try to establish it all around the world, right? This is very important. And that's why the many advocates from the LGBTQ ideology, frankly, they're just, they advocate a form of intellectual narcissism, right? They think they're right, or a form of intellectual egocentrism. Their way of seeing the world is the only way of seeing the world. No, I'm so sorry. And once we can show that just by what we discussed so far, we should now say to them, leave us alone. By virtue of this, because of this, leave us alone. We can show that you have assumptions that are not absolute and they are not universal. Therefore, leave us alone. You have no right to force this down our throats. So, LGBTQ plus or Islam. And this, now let's talk about a framework for engagement. So the very important thing for us to understand is that as believers, we should be on the offensive, not the defensive. Sometimes we're too much on the defensive, okay? And we need to be on the greatest form of defense is attack. So we should be on the intellectual offensive, because the LGBT ideology and Islam basically holds contrasting worldviews and paradigms. Yeah, we have a different view on morality and rights. They're grounded in different ontologies, how the source and nature of reality, right? They're grounded in different understanding of the source and nature of reality. They represent distinct perspectives, right? And therefore, the conclusion should lead to which perspective is correct, which worldview is correct, which paradigm is correct. So this would allow us to focus on the foundational aspects of Islam. That Allah exists, that He's worthy of worship, that Islam is true, that the Prophet ﷺ should be followed. And we have arguments for this. We could give people showcase the veracity of the Islamic worldview. Because given the fact that we have shown that the LGBTQ plus ideology has its own assumptions based on its own worldview, and some of these assumptions, by the way, contradict each other as well. But the point here is, given the fact that's the case, and Islam, what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, that Islam has its own perspective on this, and the reason that's the case because it comes from different contrasting paradigms and worldviews, different ontologies, you know, the understanding of the source and nature of reality. Therefore, the question should follow, the intellectual question should follow, which worldview is correct? And that's what we want them. That's the da'wah, calling them to Allah, calling them to Tawheed, calling them to His names and attributes, calling them to worshipping Him, calling them to following the Prophet ﷺ. We have good arguments for this. So that's why we should advocate for the Islamic worldview, explain the concept of Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and the rational basis of Islam, emphasize monotheism, emphasize worshipping Allah, purpose in life, the Quran, divine revelation, and assert that these foundations determine the truth about issues such as how we should act, about gender, about sexuality. And we should position Allah as the ultimate authority and grounded in Islamic tradition, in Islamic teachings. So it's about framing the issue. So if we highlight to the LGBTQ plus advocates that their worldview is not universal and it's not universally accepted, and it's based on assumptions we can challenge, and it's based on a worldview and assumptions that are not absolute, then it should encourage the openness of a possibility of an alternative. And we should say, look, therefore, if it is about your frame of reference, your assumptions, your worldview, and Islam has a different set of assumptions, frame of reference, and worldview, then we should ask what worldview, what paradigm is correct. And therefore, we could start talking about the foundations of Islam as we just discussed. So let's quickly talk about Islam's take on these assumptions. So the assumption number one was about these people think they possess their own bodies. Well, Islam says no. Allah fundamentally owns our bodies. Yes, we have been given agency by Allah to use our bodies, but in a way that pleases Him, that doesn't contravene His law. But ontologically, Allah, the source and nature of our body is Allah. Allah owns us. This is a basic aspect of the Tawheed of Rububiyyah, the oneness of Allah's lordship or creative agency. Allah is the King of all kings. He owns us. He's the master of everything that exists. He's the nourisher, the Lord, the King of all kings. Allah has ultimate ownership. These arms, me, Hamza, is owned by Allah. So, it's very important. And just to highlight again, yes, this is the lordship of Allah. This is Allah's lordship over all creation. But Islam appreciates that humans have agency over their bodies, right? And they've been given free will to act in any possible way. However, this free will comes with a responsibility to obey Allah's commands. And Allah's commands are expressive of His will, which is in line with His nature. Allah is Al-Bar, the source of all goodness. Allah is Al-Hakim, the wise. Al-Alim, the knowing. He is Al-Rahman, the lovingly merciful, the intensely merciful. Allah is Al-Wadud, the most loving. And so given the fact that Allah is all-knowing, He is the all-wise, He's the most merciful, He's the most loving, it follows that His commands are good for us and that they ensure our personal and social prosperity and well-being. And this is not just a conceptual point. It's been substantiated through the practical application of these commands, both on a social and personal level throughout the ages. And this is very important to understand. So if you go to Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha, first verse, you go to chapter 43, verse 9, Quran 23:84, Quran 6:102, Quran 10:31, Quran 112, verses 1 and 2, and so on and so forth, you would see the lordship of Allah. Allah is telling us that He is the master and owner of everything that exists. So Islam rejects their assumption. And therefore we have no epistemic or moral obligation to accept the assumption. Why are they forcing this on us? And if they say, well, I don't believe in your assumption, fine. But we could prove our assumptions to be true. That's why we want them. That's the Dawah discourse. Bring them to Tawheed. Tell them why Islam is true. So what does Islam say on the second assumption about individual rights? Well, it's very easy. Who has the right to give us our rights? Simple as that. Allah says in chapter 7, verse 28, say, indeed, Allah does not order immorality. Do you say about Allah that which you do not know? And obviously, if we study Tawheed, affirming the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know Allah is the one who gives guidance. Allah is the one who knows what is good for us. Allah has the picture. We have the pixel on a moral and knowledge and wise perspective. Allah's wisdom and goodness and love and mercy and knowledge are the highest degree possible. They have no deficiency and no flaw. And Allah is the one who gives us our rights. So when they say, oh, well, it's your individual right, you're allowed to basically, transition to any gender and you can have same-sex intercourse, there's nothing wrong with this, it's actually a right enshrined in law, we would just simply say, well, we don't believe in that conception of rights. Why do you think we have a moral or epistemic obligation to adopt your understanding of individual rights? That is premised usually on a secular liberal paradigm based on the primacy of the individual, which is based on individualism, which is basically the very thing that is destroying humanity. Well, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you very much. Keep it to yourself. We don't want it, right? So, we're under no moral or epistemic obligation to accept this. Allah is the one who gives us our rights. He is the one who actually wants best for us. Allah wants good for all human beings. He wants guidance for all human beings. That's why He sent down the Quran. That's why Allah says He doesn't prefer disbelief for His servants. If you look at the exegesis of this verse itself, Allah is saying to us that He wants good for people. Allah is a benevolent King. He is the benevolent King of all kings. This is so important for us to understand. Allah has given us rights. We have this in the Islamic tradition, huquq al-ibad, the rights of the worldly servants. But it's the conception through divine guidance. And divine guidance is based on Allah's limitless knowledge, perfect, pure knowledge, His love, His mercy, His utmost goodness. And these rights are good for us. And they're the right rights, the right conception of rights. We don't have to follow their conception, a negative view or positive view, or the kind of secular liberal conception of these rights. No. We're under no moral obligation to accept that. Now, they may say, but I don't believe in this conception. Good. This is where we want you. Well, now let's talk about Tawheed. Let's talk about why Allah exists, why He's worthy of worship, why these rights are actually good for us, and where they're coming from. So Islam on number 3, when the assumption that says, well, there are no sound moral objections to gender fluidity and same-sex intercourse. Well, with all due respect, we would challenge this. We would challenge this because we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the one who gives us our morality. We are divine command theorists. We're not utilitarian ethicists or deontological ethicists. Yes, we have the concept of the masalih and the mafasid, the benefits and the harms, for sure, and it's within the Islamic moral legal framework, but it's within a Islamic paradigm. We're not utilitarian thinkers, and we don't adopt, the secular normative ethical theories of utilitarianism and deontological ethics. We're fundamentally divine command theorists. It's good because the commands of Allah are based on His will, and His will is in line with who He is, His nature. And He is Al-Bar, the source of all goodness. Allah is Al-Ilah, the only deity worthy of worship. Allah is Ar-Rahman, the merciful. Allah is Al-Wudud, the most loving. Allah is Al-Hakim, the wise. And His names and attributes are maximally perfect to the highest degree possible. And His commands are essentially a derivative of this. And, we would challenge, for example, utilitarian thinking. We would challenge, for example, deontological thinking. For example, from a deontological perspective, we would say, well, can the human mind fully understand what moral values and duties are? Who is to judge? To whom do we owe the duty to be good? Aren't duties owed? Who can make the universal moral claim and judgment? How do we prioritize them? How do we apply them? Now, the human mind is limited. It has a pixelated understanding of moral realities. Allah has the picture, we just got the pixel. So we would challenge the deontological ethicists by saying, well, can the human mind fully understand what moral duties and values are? Who is to judge? To whom do we own the duty to be good? Are duties owned? Who can make the universal moral claim and judgment? How do we prioritize them? How do we apply them? Islam has answers to these questions. And the answer lies with the one who is perfect, the one who is most loving, all-knowing, the one who is most wise, the one who is all-powerful. Allah. And that is a sufficient rational answer by virtue of who Allah is. Now they will say, I don't believe in Allah. I don't believe it. Okay, khalas, this is where we want you. Stop trying to shove this ideology down our throats and let's discuss these fundamental aspects. And once we could show you that, then our understanding becomes more coherent. And we could also challenge the utilitarian ethicists. And we could say, can the human mind fully investigate the consequences or the implications of one's moral behavior? Isn't there a secular or metaphysical bias in investigating the consequences, right? What about the akhirah? If heaven and hell exist, it changes how you understand the moral actions, right? If you ignore or reject the hereafter, then your assessment of the consequences can be incomplete or totally wrong. So even just by what is happiness? What is well-being? Maybe you have an individualistic understanding of well-being. How do you truly know the impact between an individual and society or the collective? What is the dynamic here? What frame of reference are you using to understand all of that? With all due respect, we say Allah, because Allah knows, we don't. And we could prove that to be the case. And so it's very important for us to understand that Allah is the one who gives us our morality, not secular normative theories such as ethical theories such as deontological ethics or utilitarianism. Because we could say Allah can make the universal moral claim. Allah is not limited. His knowledge and wisdom are maximally perfect without any deficiency and flaw. He transcends the contingent and created reality, and therefore he could make the universal moral claim. Also, Allah has the moral picture. By virtue of Allah's nature, as we just discussed, Allah knows the full and complete consequences of our moral actions. And finally, Allah is the ultimate judge, and we have a duty towards Him. Because of Allah's nature, by virtue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's nature, He is the ultimate judge with regards to what is good and bad. We have an obligation to follow Allah's commands because He's the only being worthy of worship, and that includes obedience and submission, and He's the only being worthy of worship and He's the only being that is maximally good because He is Al-Bar, He is the source of all goodness. Again, this all depends on believing in Allah and His revelation, but this is exactly where we want them. Stop shoving this ideology down your throat. Understand you have 5 incoherent assumptions that can be challenged. Understand they're not universal and absolute. Understand we have our own perspective. That perspective comes from a particular worldview and allow us to show you why that worldview is true. So, obviously, they'll have a contention such as Euthyphro's dilemma and so on and so forth, but you could look at our other works on Sapiens website or our videos that actually addresses these kind of detractions from a moral perspective, moral philosophy perspective in detail. But I'm going to address it very quickly. So what they would say is, you believing Allah's commands presents a dilemma, and they cite Euthyphro's dilemma, which originally was about polytheism, but it's been applied by atheists to monotheism. And they basically say, is it good because Allah commanded it, or is it good because the commands of Allah are good? Now we would say, well, this is a false dilemma. But before we say this, let's understand what the dilemma is. So the first horn of the dilemma is it good because Allah commanded it? Well, if that's the case, then they say that Allah's commands are arbitrary. Allah could have commanded to kill everyone over the age of 60. And by virtue of that, by virtue of Him just commanding it, it's good. So therefore, there should be nothing in the real world that we should recognize as objectively good or bad. The other horn of the dilemma is, it's good because the commands of Allah are good. Well, if the commands of Allah are good, then you're judging the commands with an external goodness. Because how do you know they're good? Therefore, good is external to Allah's commands. So therefore, you don't need Allah to understand what good is. Now, there's different approaches to this in the Islamic schools of creed, but I think one of the best answers is by Sheikh Shawil al-Dahlawi, and I was taught this by Sheikh Abdurrahman Mihrig, and it's a fantastic answer. And basically he says, yes, it's good because God commanded it, but we reject that it's arbitrary. Why are you assuming it's arbitrary just because God commanded it? Now, you could go one route, you could talk about God's nature and so on and so forth, but one good route is to say the following. Allah's commands, manifested in Islamic moral and legal law, addresses the moral needs of human beings on a personal, social, and political level. The commands of Allah are like a key that perfectly fit in a lock that opens the door to well-being and functioning for individuals and social harmony. And I'm not referring to well-being and social harmony in a moral sense. A key is designed for a lock. And just like a key is designed for a lock, the commands of Allah are designed for our well-being. Therefore, it is completely irrational and absurd to claim that Allah's commands are arbitrary. To argue and to claim that they're arbitrary is equivalent of claiming that a specific key that opens a specific door was not designed. So yeah, we say it's because of Allah's commands, but we reject the idea that Allah's commands are arbitrary by virtue of what we just said. And there's more to it than that, but that's a sufficient answer for now. What about Islam's take on assumption number 4, that, desires form our identity? Well, Islam says no. Desires and sexuality do not form our true identity. Why do we say that this is self-empowerment? And this is very interesting because in Islamic tradition, which, we don't have to unpack too much, but generally speaking, this whole notion of who are you is a kind of nonsense, kind of post-secular, post-modern, post-liberal kind of notion of New Age spirituality. I don't think there is anything in the Quran that talks about, find yourself in that way. Basically, what that is kind of like people who deny religion, believe in some kind of superpower, supernatural power, and they just want to feel good about themselves. And they're like, oh, I'm going to find myself. That is a nonsense question. I'm 43 years old. That question is nonsense. Who is Hamza? Yani, I've given up on that question yet. Hamza is different with different people. because we're human beings, we're not human doings. And to be is to be related. You discover yourself through your relationships, and the greatest relationship is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your creator, the one that created you. And if that is intact, then the true you will be revealed. It's no wonder that Allah says, do not be like those who forgot Allah, and Allah made them forget their own selves. Right? If you remember Allah, Allah will remember you. It's as if our sense of self-identity is contingent, dependent on our relation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To be is to be related. I relate, therefore I am. It's not I think, therefore I am. I relate, therefore I am. In actual fact, it's I love, therefore I am. Why? Because the greatest relationship is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the greatest manifestation of that relationship, which is worship, through worship, is love, because worship entails love. As Ibn Kathir, Ibn Taymiyyah, and many others said, that what's ibadah, coming from the root abada, which means subjugation, it actually means the extreme of love and the extreme of submission. It means the perfection of love and the perfection of submission. Allahu Akbar. That's why one of the best translations of Surah Al-Fatiha, when it says, it is you that we worship, we say, it is you that we humbly adore, right? Anyway, that's another discussion. The point is, your sense of understanding of who you are through your relationships. And also it has a very liberal bias, because, when you say, I'm going to follow my desires, where are those desires coming from? Where are they coming from? I thought we lived in hierarchies with social constructs and with a particular use of language, right? So that's dictating maybe your feelings and your understanding of desires, or that it's evoking certain desires. So they're not really yours, are they? Right? Because you are your environment. If you look at social psychology, theories of social influence, normative social influence, informational social influence, we submit to the social norm in a way. And that's how the social norm is developed. So who are you? You're seeing it from a very individualistic, atomistic perspective. Because what is a personality on a desert island? What is compassion on a desert island? Fine, you can have self-care, I get it. But what is real personality on a desert island? It doesn't exist. You need to relate to something and someone. Which reminds me of the Sahaba when they went to Prophet ﷺ and they were complaining that when they go to their wives, they're a bit different. When they go to their family, they're a bit different. The person, this is normal. This is not hypocrisy. This is normal. You're going to be different with different people. You are revealed through your relations. And the greatest relation was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's where you're going to truly find yourself, when you find Allah. Do not be like those who forgot Allah and Allah made them forget themselves. Anyway, the point here is we have social pressure. Informational social influence is basically that we have a need to feel certain. If we don't find that certainty within our immediate group, we're gonna basically submit to the dominant group. Normative social influence, that we have a need to belong. And if we can't get that belonging from our immediate group, we're going to submit to the dominant group. This is how social psychology works. Just study these basic social psychological phenomena, and you will see. So, so how do you know they're really your desires? And you don't even know that. They may be evoked as a result of your environment, as a result of these influences. They're not really you. How do you know they're good for you? How do you know pursuing them are good for you? What are the extremes that you can pursue? Because no one's going to say that, you could pursue all of the desires to the extreme. That would be very unhealthy. That won't be self-empowerment. That won't be liberating. That won't be, what do you call it? Having well-being. You need to answer these questions. So just to assume that, you identify with your desires, and therefore you feel one day maybe you're going to have same-sex attraction, the other day you're going to become a lesbian, the next day you're going to become, because according to gender theory, you could do that. The queer, you could do that. On Monday, I'll be a black lesbian. On Tuesday, I'll be a French homosexual. On Wednesday, I'll be a Nigerian heterosexual. On Thursday, I'll be a two-spirit penguin. On Friday, I'll be, I don't know, whatever. Do you see my point? That's allowed within queer theory principles, right? Anyway, so the thing is, this is an animalistic, bestial way of dealing with this. You identify with these desires. Number one, the desires are not necessarily yours. They could be evoked because of social pressure and, as we discussed, and social influence. Number two, how do you know how to manifest these desires, and to what degree? How do you know they're actually good for you? And why do you say that you should identify with them? They're just desires. To identify yourself just with these kind of desires is no different than being an animal. And we're supposed to be like elevate ourselves from this bestial aspect of the human being. But look what Allah is trying to say to us. Allah is saying your primary identity is worshipping Allah, is connecting to Allah, is you submitting to Allah's guidance. Allah makes this clear in the Quran in chapter 28, verse 50. And who is more astray than the one who follows his desire without guidance from Allah? Who is more astray? If you don't have Allah's guidance, you're astray. Indeed, Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people. Also, Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 138, this is the natural way of Allah. And who is better than Allah in ordaining a way? And we worship none by Him, but Him. Quran chapter 30, verse 30, adhere to the natural, way of Allah, natural fitrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way, the fitrah that Allah has created, the natural disposition that Allah has created within us. And this is very important, very, very important for us to understand. So our primary identity is that we acknowledge that we are humble, adoring servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we don't worship our desires. Even Allah says, have you not seen those who take the desire as their Lord? To take as their God their desire. We fundamentally disagree and disconnect ourselves from the idea that your desires and sexuality is your true identity as a human being. We have an elevated discourse. Human beings have been given dignity by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have an ultimate purpose in life to worship Him, to obey Him, to love Him, to adore Him. And we're elevating ourselves from the bestial aspects of the human being. Yes, we have desires, but we control them. We have given a path to express ourselves and have true well-being. Allah is not saying don't have sex. Allah is not saying don't make love, of course, but within the ethical framework. In marriage between a man and a woman, it's good for the individual and society. And the whole Islamic society is structured around that. And it's structured around elevating yourself from just your bestial desires. Yes, I'm going to be angry sometimes. Yes, I may have, maybe deviated sexual ideas sometimes, or desires, or whatever the case may be, but I control them because I am not the animal version of me. I am the elevated version of me. Allah wants to elevate us from that. And this is very important for us to understand. The final one, language. Okay. So queer theory, what we discussed about social hierarchies and the applied postmodern principles of radical skepticism and, rejecting any kind of biological markers, and also that we live in social hierarchies and people have power and they use language to perpetuate those so-called truths. But because language doesn't represent reality, then we could change the language, therefore change the truth. You remember the whole Derridian understanding of language as we discussed. And fundamentally, we just reject this. And I think, not much needs to be said on this. But the first thing is we believe that actually language does represent reality. Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, the very famous verse, that He taught Adam the names of things. This is so important. Allah taught Adam the names of things. What does this mean? According to the classical commentators, Allah teaching Adam alayhi salam the names of things refers to inspiring in Adam, the first human, knowledge of the essence of things, their properties and names, and the foundations of the branches of knowledge, right? And this is important. So we believe language can represent reality. It's not just relational. It's not, meaning is not within the relational discourse. Language can represent an external reality. We reject the Derridian postmodern queer theory understanding of language. Yes, language can be abused for sure, but we reject that notion. Furthermore, academic studies confirm that there is a plethora of biological, physiological, and psychological differences in men and women, right? Because this whole idea of that, science is, we need to be radically skeptical because, we live in social hierarchies and people have certain power in these hierarchies and they oppress us with their conception of what is true, and they use language that doesn't represent reality, that's relational, that's very phallocentric, male-centric, and is very hierarchical, and they use that language to perpetuate those so-called truths, and therefore what they talk about a man and a woman is actually false. So we say no, because there are academic studies, biological, physiological, psychological studies that show the differences between men and women. As Allah says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and the male is not like the female. And this is very important. And we don't have to adopt this kind of radical skepticism. Yeah. Also, if we wholeheartedly adopt, for example, the so-called agenda of the queer theorists, then we could just expose it, as I just did previously. That fine, if you're radically skeptical about use of language because it's relational, it doesn't represent reality, the meaning is within the discourse, it's phallogocentric, it's male-centric, it's based on a hierarchy, and it's misused. And if you believe that you should be radically skeptical about any truth, even biological truths, therefore you can make up your own truths by changing the hierarchy and changing the language, and they apply that to sexuality and gender, therefore I can say I'm a black lesbian. I mentioned it before. I don't think anyone who has a sane, rational mind would accept that I'm a black lesbian, right? I am married, alhamdulillah, heterosexual relationship. I'm visibly a man. I'm visibly not black, right? So what you could do is just expose queer theory or expose that fifth assumption just by giving them these thought experiments. Show them that the argument reduces to absurdity, that the way they apply their radical skepticism and their view of language and the understanding of hierarchy, that it reduces itself to absurdity. That is the best way to do it, and keep on agitating that, keep on showing them different examples of that, of absurdity. Now, look, there is one undercutting defeater, though, which is very, very powerful in my view. Okay? And I want you to listen to this. An undercutting defeater to queer theorists and related postmodernists is in the following glaring epistemological contradiction. I want you to listen carefully. If you remember, proponents of queer theory, they claim that hierarchies and language are sources of oppression and harm. Remember, they even said that it could be violent. I want you to think about this very carefully. They say that we live in hierarchies and people hold power and they oppress us with what they think is true. People use language, which is relational, doesn't represent reality, and the meaning is within the discourse, very phallogocentric, is male-centric, and that language is used to oppress us or to oppress us with their version of truth. So what they say is hierarchies and language are objective sources of oppression and truth. But here's the contradiction. Their own theory states that there are no objective values that can be perceived because they are a result of powerful hierarchies and language that can be challenged but not completely destroyed. So paradoxically, their own theoretical apparatus requires them to acknowledge that no forms of injustice, harm, or oppression exist in the world with certainty, which makes all of the prescriptions susceptible to criticism. In other words, since queer theorists and postmodernist scholars cannot provide an objective definition of the good, they must also admit that all the perceived wrongs that they label as oppression through hierarchies and the phallogocentric nature of language is nothing more than the result of the subjective whims. In a nutshell, they say use of hierarchies and powerful structures in those hierarchies. People hold the power in those hierarchies, and the use of language and how these people of power in those hierarchies use that language to perpetuate a particular truth, that's oppressive. That's injustice. That's wrong. But their very own principles are saying that there is no objective truth. There is no, remember, radical skepticism, postmodern principle, there is no objective method to acquire an objective truth. So there's a kind of glaring contradiction here. So Islam actually does believe that language can represent reality by virtue of the verse that we spoke about. And also when we talk about this contradiction, we talk about the absurdities of applying their queer theory principles, which really have been derived from postmodern principles, is applied postmodern principles, and we show the absurdity of their claims. It's enough to show how Islam's take on this issue is coherent. So finally, my dear brothers and sisters, we have unpacked the 5 assumptions, talked about Islam's take on those assumptions, and we've given you a framework for engagement. Now, the final thing to do is to go through two basic contentions, right? The first contention is they say, hey, don't force your assumption on us. Well, exactly. Thank you very much. This is exactly what I want to hear from you, because you're doing that to us in the schools, in law, ideologically, in the social sphere and space. That's what you are doing. And since you have admitted now, by virtue of this response, that we both have assumptions, stop shoving your ideology down our throats. Have the humility and realize we need to discuss the basis of these assumptions. This is exactly what we want to discuss. Our assumptions come from an intellectual, spiritual foundation that is true. We want to show it's true, and what comes from truth is true. This is where we want you. We want you to respond this way. Okay, okay, you've exposed our assumptions, but you have assumptions too. Don't force these assumptions on us. Okay, exactly. This is where we want you. Since you've admitted that we both have assumptions, stop shoving our ideology down our throats. Have the humility that we come from a particular paradigm or worldview, and allow us to discuss our worldview because we believe it's true, and what comes from truth is true. The next one is love is love. Now, with all due respect, I don't believe that even some so-called students who identify as being Muslim actually, get affected by this. This is the most nonsensical rhetorical trap I have heard. Love is love. All right. Water is water. Drink from the toilet bowl. Sex is sex. Make love to a corpse. Food is food. Eat my vomit or your dead mother. With all due respect. Come on. This is a nonsensical rhetorical trap. Of course, Muslims are people of love. The Prophet said, love for humanity with love for yourself. This is a hadith in Tarikh al-Kabir narrated by Bukhari. The language is linnas, love for humanity with love for yourself. So we believe in being intentional and directional to people, that we intend good for them, and we're directing good for them, we want goodness and guidance for them. Even An-Nawawi, the famous classical scholar, when he was commenting on the prophetic tradition, the 13th hadith tradition of the Prophet ﷺ in his Arba'in, in his 40 hadith, that says, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. You won't truly believe unless you love for your brother what you love for yourself. This akhihi, he said, this means Muslim brotherhood, but he also said it can be extended to insaniya, humanity. And he said we need to want goodness and guidance for people. That's love. I want you to be the optimal version for yourself. I want you to find out who you truly are through your relationship with your Creator. We want total good for you. We want you to be in eternal bliss in paradise. Allah wants that too. That's love. Love is intentional and directional. And to truly love someone, you have to be dedicated to their well-being, their goodness and guidance. And that is the question. Well-being, goodness and guidance. These need to be defined and understood. We understand them from the truth, from Islam. You understand them from shahawat, blameworthy desires, and this false ideology. You don't truly love them because you don't know what guidance is. You don't know what goodness is. You don't even know what well-being is. You cannot truly love someone if you claim that they should just follow their made-up sexual identity that goes against their innate nature, that defies Allah's commands. In fact, you are oppressing them, because to truly love someone, it has to be intentional and directional. You want well-being, goodness, and guidance for them. I want you to tell me what well-being is, what goodness is, and what guidance is. We can do that, and we could show you why that's good. But your assumptions are incoherent and baseless, and they reduce themselves to absurdity. We can show you that following Islam is the best thing for you. That's love. So don't give me this nonsensical rhetorical trap. Okay. So, what's up? That was a long conversation. Right. So we don't have much time, my dear brothers and sisters. Yeah. What shall we do? What shall we do? Shall we take some questions? Because we've got about 15 minutes remaining. Let's take some questions. Does anyone want to come on the live? I'm going to share it on the comments. You should get it. I'll put it on one of the banners. Bear with me. Okie dokie. There you go. Let's take a question. If you could ask a question on the comments, or you can basically go directly to I'll try and scroll the comments. Yeah. Be respectful, yeah? So be nice, respectful questions. So so we don't have much time, so please think about your questions and put them through. Okay, someone has a question. If you have a question, just you could ask it via the comments, or what you can do is there's the link right here. You can see it right there, and you could just join me and talk to me if that's easier for you. Okay, so I can't see any questions yet. So this is your opportunity to either come talk or have a conversation. All right, good. We have brother Salim. Salim.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamualaikum. How you, brother? You have a Turkish name, yes?
Yes, I am Turkish.
Merhaba abi. Nasılsınız? İyi misin?
I'm impressed actually.
MashaAllah. How
Yeah,
are you,
there
bro?
is I'm sorry. Hi. You're live. Okay. No, all is good. Okay. Alhamdulillah, I'm good. İyiyim çok şükür. Fransa'da yaşıyorum aslında şu an.
I didn't understand that. Ya, Türkçe biraz abi. Türkçe biraz.
Nerede öğrendin?
Where did I learn this from?
Yes.
Is that what you said? Yeah, I learned it from my arkadaş, my friends. Yeah,
Nice.
I had a lot of Turkish friends growing up in Hackney, Stoke Newington.
Okay, nice.
What's your question, my brother?
Yes, okay. My question is, I wrote it down for ease. So you effectively addressed the LGBTQ dilemma in the West, and I thank you for that. It was very well broken down. But additionally, I wanted to ask about this ideology gradually gaining acceptance within Islamic countries. Given that the framework for this ideology to grow differs significantly between the West and Islamic countries, where Islamic countries still have a strong hold on Islamic axioms that should not be able to integrate this ideology. How do you see the LGBTQ ideology evolve in Islamic countries?
Yeah, so I can't make a proper assessment on this, although I am aware that Islamic countries. Bear with me, I just lost my. I've lost my window. 1 second. Bear with me. There you go. I got it back. Yeah. So I'm not fully aware of what's happening across the Muslim world concern, but I am aware that things are happening. So there is a little small movement in Turkey. Alhamdulillah, they don't really have many marches. They get in trouble. They get, it's not socially accepted, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, our view would be that an Islamic society should be run by Islam, right, as much as possible. And the upsetting thing about the LGBTQ plus ideology is that it's actually forcing itself, right? Like, for example, if you look at UK schools, there was a liberal newspaper that basically said that the LGBTQ plus ideology was being taught in schools, and all of a sudden you had an explosion of non-binary and queer or trans children, yeah, and even in certain cases in America and even in the UK, that you have, for example, this idea of gender affirming care, where people, these children are not allowed to vote, they can't get married, they can't make financial decisions, and yet they are allowed puberty blockers, and some of them have removed breast tissue. And some of them actually have created a phallus, and I'm sorry to say this, but in many cases it's done through the rectum, and it doesn't work, and it smells, and these people are depressed and they want to commit suicide. And a lot of them started at a young age before they could make even rational decisions like marriage, finance, and voting. And that's why we have to make a distinction in some cases between the ideology and the individual, because some people actually go through what some people say same-sex attraction, yeah, and we have to make the distinction that this is a a thing that can happen to someone, and there's an Islamic way of dealing with it. In actual fact, I had a particular case when I was speaking to one brother. We believe that if someone comes to you and they say, look, I have certain feelings, I need help, we say, fine, if you're willing to have a conversation as an adult, I can help you through this. And this brother ended up getting married, he's got children, he's really happy. He understood that this same-sex attraction was actually was in particular constructed through certain problems that he had with his father in particular, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people have different perspectives. So sometimes we're fed the idea that we have this particular problem and that you have to identify it as if it becomes part of your identity. But the issue is, when a Muslim comes, or any human being comes, and they have a certain feelings, Islam is not there to basically say, oh, you're an immoral person because you have a feeling or you have an attraction. Islam basically says, well, it's about manifesting that particular action, especially in the context of Islamic society, is same-sex intercourse. I don't even want to call it homosexuality. It's a same-sex intercourse. That's what's haram, right? The same-sex intercourse, right? In terms of the public act. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say is, look, obviously in Islamic society, it has its own social, psychological goals. It has its own cohesive values it wants to propagate. It has its own hierarchies and structures that will try and facilitate an optimal society for the collective and the individuals. So when you have that, you're very unlikely to have these movements and these ideologies, right? And that's why when you see the presentation that I delivered today, actually it's come from certain thinkers and it's been applied in a way that's absolutely absurd. Because in my view, in my personal view, this is not to do with truth for them. They don't care about truth. They don't care about people's well-being. And you know that because they've called mutilation gender affirming care, right? They don't care about even the idea of consent, right? Because these children are children, yet they could decide whether they should remove breast tissue or have puberty blockers. They can't even vote. This is oppression. What they want, bro, they have deified freedom. They want to be absolutely free. That's what it is. But absolute freedom is only an aspect of Allah's divinity. Allah is Al-Ghani. Allah is absolutely rich, free. Allah is As-Samad, the independent. Everything is dependent on Him. So it's almost like an internal shirk, honestly. They are chasing this notion of absolute freedom. Like the thinker Martin Lings actually mentioned this. He said they're chasing this, false notion of absolute freedom, but in reality it's coming from the nafs and the ego and the shahawat and blameworthy desires. I really believe it's an ideology of desire. It's an ideology of wanting to be like God, in my view, because they want to basically be absolutely free, but you're limited, you're human. Only Allah is absolutely free.
So you would say,
yeah.
So you would
sorry
say
if
that,
I didn't answer the question because I'm trying to think about it, but
no, you answered it more broadly than I expected, because my question was, I'm not afraid about the spread of homosexuality because it's a sin and it has been spread from the beginning, from a long time ago. It's the mechanism that led to the normalization of homosexuality within the Islamic society that I'm afraid of. The mechanism that allowed this normalization within the West. But I think you answered it by saying that the Islamic values in Islamic society would put a safeguard from these ideological.
Yes. So Islamic education, Islamic values, the Islamic social model, the cohesive values that propagate in society, the understanding of identity as well. Because this is very important, because a lot of people don't know who they are, right? But Islam has a very unique understanding of what is your identity, what is your role, what is your purpose. These are all very powerful things. And obviously, we don't really have the ideal structure in today's world. But this is what we want, because we believe it's good for the individual and it's good for society. And don't forget, you have to understand that this LGBTQ plus ideology is used as a weapon to liberalize nations and to secularize nations, and it comes with money. So you have to understand that as well. Like many Muslim countries, many leaders have their hands tied behind their back, or one hand is tied, or one hand is allowed to do what it wants. Today's politics is very murky. I don't know the chess playing game. This is why I don't really mention leaders by name, because we're finding it difficult to deal with a household. Imagine a state.
I live
I'm
in
gonna
Saudi Arabia, so I wouldn't name anyone.
no, but I don't think we should. Yes, we could hold people to account. We could hold policies to account for sure. But to mention names in a derogatory way, I think is
Yeah,
bad
I
adab.
wouldn't. Yeah.
Because, Yani, bro, are you married?
No.
Do you have a family? Okay, may Allah grant you a pious wife, inshallah. So I'm married, have a family, and yeah, we're struggling to, maintain that. No one's saying they're going to be the perfect dad or husband. Now imagine now trying to do that on a state level. I'm going to have some humility, man. So I know there's a lot of things going on, the harms and the benefits. We don't know if they don't do this, something worse can happen for sure. But what I wanted to say in that was, it's being used as a weapon. So they're saying, if you want this money, if you want this aid, or if you want this contract, then we have to liberalize you, or you have to basically adopt, this conception of reality, this conception of society. But yeah, so it is quite dangerous. But look, we need to be more on the offensive and talk about things like this. I framed it in a very nice way in the beginning. You have to be just and kind to people, use hikmah, but expose the assumptions of what they are, and then get them to a position where they cannot shove this down our throats. And also, we should also come together as Muslims, and as not only just Muslims, but human beings, because the majority of humanity disagree with this. This is actually a minority ideology. If you look at the whole of the world, they're on their own. They're on their own. They are a minority, but they have the loudest voice, they have the money, and they have the power. That's why it's being propagated. So what we need to do, we need to come together with like-minded human beings and actually fight back ideologically as well.
Exactly.
And I don't think it's going to last. It's so against the fitrah of the human being. Like, I just cannot see it happening. There are so many horrific cases. And we had, a lot of the American thinkers or the right-wing activists or center-right activists, they've done videos and documentaries, and they've actually exposed the ideology for what it is. But anyway.
My fear stems, I don't know if I don't want to monopolize, so...
No, not at all. It's fine.
My fear stems from the hadith that says that I fear from my community that one day homosexuality will be legalized, will be halal. So it's the hadith state fear, so it doesn't say that it will be allowed. So I don't know if
I'm not aware of that hadith. I'll have to look at it. But
no.
Given that obviously we should all have that fear that we don't want our societies to basically disobey Allah, because disobedience of Allah is bad for the individual and society. Obeying Allah is good for the individual and society. It will optimize us. We'll have great well-being in this life and the hereafter. We believe this. We'll have a good life in this life and in the akhirah. So I think also we have to also understand that we should take it from an individual case-by-case basis as well, because some people who have these affinities, for example, or these feelings, a lot of them, from my experience as well, have come from bad parenting. They've got very bad kind of relationships with their father, for instance. They've had trauma. So, on a personal one-to-one basis, we have to be compassionate and actually help them through that journey. And it does work. Me and others, we've had experiences where people have actually, found the right way, if you like. And you just have to unpack all of those issues. And that's why we have to be sensitive to that as well, because sometimes we we can make something too political when it comes to the individual. And this is something that we shouldn't do, because the sunnah of giving dawah, the sunnah of relating people to people individually, is to actually individualize them, understand the individual context, the nuances, your background, who are you, this, that, and the other. And that's why Islam is very rich psychologically from that perspective. So, but anyway, bro, look, this is why we need more things like this to create awareness, because a lot of the people, especially the Muslim thinkers or activists or students, they're not empowered. They get consumed, and there's this LGBTQ ideological hegemonic force, making you feel really bad that you're not accepting their worldview. And we should empower people to be compassionate and wise, but assertive. Say, no, we disagree with you, and this is why. You have these assumptions. We have our worldview. Let's talk about tawheed to bring the discussion back to dawah as well. So and I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. You can't intellectualize everything because this is an ideological war, if you like. There's other things that need to be involved on a state level, political level, on a financial level, on a collective level. I get it. But from the perspective and objective of sapiens, we're here to basically unpack that, it's not Islamic, the LGBTQ plus ideology in any shape or form, as we discussed. LGBTQ plus ideology has 5 false assumptions at least. Some of them contradict each other. They're incoherent and not absolute. Therefore, they shouldn't shove it down our throats. We have more of a current position based upon just what those positions are and that they come from a foundation that is true. And we can show the absurdity of their positions as well, that they're basically anti-human in my view, and they're oppressive and they're very dangerous. And we've heard some horror stories from human beings, who we should be taking care of and helping, and we should be committed to their well-being and their guidance and their goodness. But these people have basically escaped us, and they've basically been mutilated, and a lot of them regret it. A lot of them,
And a lot of those proponents are victims themselves of these
yes,
ideas.
absolutely,
They are
absolutely,
not aware of this. So that's
absolutely.
why we shouldn't be aggressive when we address this ideology, because these people are. You come like a doctor. You prescribe a medicine to someone that
Yeah,
doesn't want to be healed.
yeah.
So
I mean, on an
you
individual level, yeah, we shouldn't be aggressive. But sometimes on ideological level, we have to be assertive, yeah, because they're
yes,
assertive to us. They say you're bigots, you're this. And I say, hold on a second, we're going to have some self-respect here. Do you want an intellectual discussion or not? If you want one, we'll have a discussion. Because sometimes, there's a lot of name calling and abuse, and sometimes we have to stand our ground. Yeah, we have to be. I call it being positively assertive. But anyway, my brother, the time is up now. May Allah bless you,
yes.
bro. And I really
Thank you
hope.
very much, Hamza.
I really hope Turkey wins tomorrow. I don't know if you like football or not,
Yes,
but
I will watch it. I will watch it.
yeah,
Inshallah.
we'll make dua that Turkey wins Euro 2024. Inshallah.
Amin.
Khair.
Amin.
Allah bless you, bro. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Allah bless
Assalamu
you.
alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.